session is to be given by Dr. Andrew Poppe. He has been in Berkeley. You were a student there, right?
No, I was a student at the University of Colorado at Boulder with Mihai Harani.
Oh, okay. That's why Joshua Cowell mentioned your name, you know.
Yes, we overlapped very briefly at Colorado before he left for Florida. Yes.
Okay, good. Now you're in Berkeley, but I think you like California better than Colorado, I suppose.
Very sunny here. It's hard to beat. So.
Okay, go ahead.
Sure, I will go ahead and get started. Well, first off, thanks for inviting me. Okay, so thank you again for having me. My name is Andrew Poppe. I'm a research scientist at the Space Sciences Laboratory at the University of California at Berkeley. And I was invited to give a talk here about ARTEMIS observations at the moon, and in particular, I'm going to focus on a project I worked on a couple years ago, looking at the ARTEMIS observations of solar wind interaction with crustal magnetic fields on the lunar surface, and how the ARTEMIS mission, which has been in orbit around the moon now for almost 10 years, it'll be 10 years this summer, has actually really helped us to understand the distribution of how these crustal magnetic fields interact with the solar wind, and really tie down how much of these protons are reflecting from the lunar surface and what their follow-on impacts are. So like I said, this is a summary talk that goes along with a paper that I published in 2017, talking about ARTEMIS observations of solar wind proton scattering from lunar crustal magnetic anomalies. And I wanted to start this talk by just real quickly, briefly going through the main points I want to get across. I want everybody to be able to walk away from the talk and knowing exactly what it was we studied in this paper. So the very quick summary. So we know that from decades of observation going back to the Apollo era, that the moon has regions of crustal magnetism. We know that the moon does not have a global dipolar magnetic field. All it has is these small regions that are left over that are magnetized in the crust. And we know that these crustal magnetic fields can actually reflect the solar wind protons before they strike the surface. And so the protons come in, they interact electromagnetically somehow with the crustal magnetic fields, and they're reflected or deflected back into space. And we can observe with ARTEMIS both the downgoing protons from the original solar wind as well as the reflected protons. Like I said, we routinely observe these on almost every single orbit, especially when the ARTEMIS paraselene are on the day side. We routinely see these reflected solar wind protons in the data. Now, to analyze these and study these, I use what's called the backwards Louisville tracing, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about the mechanics of that, to basically map the fluxes that we measure with ARTEMIS in orbit back to where they're interacting at the moon, and to basically make a map. If your eyes could see how much protons were reflected, this is what the moon would look like. And so I'll walk through the actual analysis steps that I did to create this map. The results generally show that these regions where the crustal magnetic fields are generally located can reflect at least 10 to 15% of the solar wind flux. It's probably higher on smaller scales, but in some ways it's actually difficult to measure with ARTEMIS because we're at generally higher orbits than something like the Kaguya mission or Chandrayaan. And finally, one of the things that we'd be able to do with this very large data set is try to understand a little bit more about the detail of how these interactions take place. So if you're at the low subsolar zenith angles where you're at noon, we tend to see more isotropic scattering in all directions. Whereas when the crustal fields are towards the limb, towards the terminator, 6 a.m. or 6 p.m., we see a lot of forward scattering, sort of a glancing incidence from the crustal magnetic fields. So I'll talk about all of these details, but keep this in your mind. This is what I want you guys to be able to walk away with. Okay, so what is it we know or think we know about the moon's interaction with the solar wind? So to first order, it's a simple plasma absorbing body. At the top, you see a pair of panels that are the density and magnetic field from a series of hybrid simulations done by Mats Holmström back in 2011 and 2012. We know, for example, here that the moon generally absorbs most of the solar wind protons on its day side. This leaves behind a void or a wake. This leads to a compression in the magnetic field. The plasma is trying to restore the pressure that was lost when the particles were absorbed. And so it actually compresses the magnetic field as the plasma refills the wake. You see there are various structures. There's these rarefaction wings, which we actually do see in the data. There's essential compression. If you take cuts at various lengths down and you look at them in the other plane, you can see rarefaction waves both above and below this plane that generally spread out as this wake goes downstream. And more or less, generally speaking, more or less, these observations have been borne out by observation. This is a paper by Huizhang et al. In 2014, who took the first couple of years of ARTEMIS data and mapped out, for example, the density in ions, and you can very clearly see the correspondence in the model where we see the dropout in ion density to where we see it in the data. So to first order, we understand how this interaction works, but it does get more complicated to first order than this. This is because, as I mentioned before, the moon possesses these regions of crustal magnetic fields. They are very widely distributed across the lunar surface. They vary in strength from basically below the detection limit, so below 1 nanotesla or less, all the way up to several hundreds of nanotesla. They are anywhere from very small scale size. So if you can see this very small orange pixel right here, that is the well-known Reiner gamma magnetic anomaly. That's maybe tens of kilometers across. It's one of the smallest anomalies that we can actually see both with fields and with particles at the moon. And then you can see something as large as what's called the South Pole Aitken Basin region. This is on the far side of the moon, generally in the southern hemisphere. This is one of the larger regions of crustal magnetic fields. So they're very widely spread across the lunar surface. We also know that generally in the solar wind, the scale size of these anomalies is below the ion gyro radius. So this is a highly kinetic regime. It's not really something that you could get at with MHD theories. The protons are very much unmagnetized and they interact in very kinetic and non-adiabatic ways with these anomalies. Now, to first order, I drew this cartoon for a proposal that I put together, and I think it sets the picture nicely. So when the solar wind comes in, how and to what degree does it interact with these regions on the lunar surface? And so you can generally split the lunar surface up into regions that are unmagnetized. They have very low, non-detectable crustal magnetic fields. It's just the surface sitting bare exposed to the solar wind. And you can separate regions that have crustal magnetic fields. And again, these are anywhere from 1 to 10 nanotesla up to at least hundreds of nanotesla and probably more. It isn't necessarily the focus of this talk, but there's a lot of rich work that has been shown about the solar wind interaction with the unmagnetized lunar surface. We know that the incoming solar wind protons, some fraction of them actually are implanted deep into the soil. They are neutralized and they later diffuse out as either H2, potentially OH or water. That's a very open question. We know that some fraction of them come off as energetic neutral atoms. It's seen by Chandrian, it's seen by Ibex. And we actually know that even a small fraction immediately glance off the unmagnetized lunar surface and come off at about 0.1 or 1% of the incoming solar wind flux. So these are papers, for example, by Saito et al. 2008 or Lua et al. 2018. But really the focus of today's talk, of what I'll be talking about, is the regions where there are crustal magnetic fields. Some fraction of the flux, of the solar wind flux, can make it down to the surface, but we see very large fractions that are reflected, sort of re-picked up into the solar wind. And that is something we can very clearly see with ARTEMIS. And the fraction that this reflects is one of the really big questions that I got at with this study, is how much of this reflected flux is coming off of which regions at the surface. So like I mentioned, there are previous observations. We've known now for at least a decade that these crustal magnetic fields are at least coherent and strong enough to reflect some portion of the solar wind. So I show here, let's see, on the left is a very well-known figure from Lua et al. 2011 from Chandrian measurements. You can see here the very large South Pole Aitken Basin region that's very highly magnetized, which has a very significant amount of flux. You can even see smaller things like the Crisium antipode, that's otherwise known as the Gerasimovich anomaly, that are showing up. And so this was a very nice early piece of work to show the coherency that these crustal fields could reflect protons with. We've also seen them in the Kaguya data set. This is more so looking at solar wind reflection from the unmagnetized surface. In this particular example, you can see the downward going solar wind beam here at just under a keV. and then you see some amount of reflected flux coming back right up at you from the unmagnetized crust. We can also see this in energetic neutral atoms. So this is again from the Chandrian-Sena instrument, and you can see that it generally follows the cosine theta incident flux, and some fraction of that is being returned as energetic neutral atoms. So we know that from these previous missions that these various types of mechanisms are occurring both in the magnetized and unmagnetized lunar surface. Now, how exactly do the mechanics of this work? What are the physics of how these solar wind ions actually interact with crustal magnetic fields that, like I said, are smaller than the typical ion gyro links or ion inertial links? This is an excellent cartoon that was put in Saito et al. 2012 to accompany an observation or several observations by the Kaguya spacecraft, where Kaguya managed to fly above an anomaly but below or within this electric field region. And what's generally thought to be happening is that in these regions of crustal magnetic fields, the electrons themselves have small enough gyroradii to still be magnetized. So they are effectively mirrored, as shown here in the red, but in the green, the ions, like I said, have larger gyroradii. They penetrate deeper into the anomaly region, and that actually just sets up a bulk charge separation. And so you get this electric field that is then responsible for turning around the protons. Similar type things are seen in simulations. I show here a very nice figure from a hybrid model of the Gerasimovich anomaly by Fatemi et al. 2015. And this is essentially showing the reflected velocity vectors of these solar wind protons. They've gone all the way down to sometimes just a kilometer above the surface, depending on the topology and the strength of the anomaly, before they're reflected and sort of re-picked up back into the solar wind. But it's worth noting that these are difficult to see. They are relatively small scale in size. It's only missions such as Kaguya and even Chandrian that are able to penetrate these very low altitudes. They're the only spacecraft that have taken ion measurements at those low altitudes. We did have the lunar prospector measurements, but those are electrons only. So it's hard to tie these electric fields to the anomalies when we only see the electrons in lunar prospector. But generally speaking, this is what's believed to be going on at lower altitudes. It's definitely worth more in situ observations. The modeling has progressed a lot in the last 5 to 10 years, such that we think we know, we think we understand what's going on at these low altitudes, but it would be really great to get better measurements. We also know that there are broader implications for these reflected protons. So what does this do to the lunar interaction as a whole? So on the top, I actually show you current work that I'm working on with ARTEMIS, where I've taken all of the magnetic field data around the moon for the entire almost 10 years and organized it in the solar wind frame. So here's the moon generally right here. The solar wind is flowing right to left. So you see the compression in the magnetic field downstream of the moon. You see a nice rarefaction wave, but what you also see is some brighter red pixels, which are showing compressed, elevated magnetic field, both on the day side and then along this compression extending off the moon. And what that is those are actually compressions or shocks. It depends on who you talk to, which type of word is the most correct. But those are compressions that are occurring as a result of crustal magnetic fields on the lunar day side interacting with the solar wind. And again, we have various models to show us and to be able to compare and contrast. This is again from a hybrid set of simulations by Shahab Fatemi et al. In 2014, where he was reflecting protons from the lunar surface in the same way that Chandrian was observing these protons. And you can see these very nice compressions in the magnetic field in 2 different frames right here that are essentially analogous to what's seen actually in the data. And so it's good evidence that these compressions are actually coming from interactions with crustal fields on the day side. So this really speaks to the fact that these crustal fields, even though they're small in scale, they can have global effects on the lunar interaction with the solar wind. We also know that down at the smallest scales, that these interactions actually have implications for the surface itself. So bare unmagnetized solar wind surface, lunar surface that's exposed to the solar wind will generally weather over time. It'll darken, it'll lose its characteristic spectral features if you look at it with the hyperspectral instrument. But if we look at these swirls, and this is a cut through of the Reiner gamma swirl where we see alternating regions of bright and dark lanes, it's co-located with the magnetic anomaly. So we know this complex plasma physics is occurring at least right down to the surface in this Reiner gamma anomaly. And we again can perform models that put in different sets of magnetizations that are hypothesized for the Reiner gamma swirl, and then look at how that affects the solar wind flux. So you can see this is a transect across, let's see, right across the heart of Reiner gamma. And you can see that far away from the crustal fields, it's bulk solar wind hitting the surface, whereas there's all kinds of deceleration. There's peaks where it's being funneled generally into these dark lanes. This again is a simulation. We'd really like to get measurements for this close to the surface. And actually, NASA announced just not long ago that in 2023, hopefully there'll be a lunar lander to Reiner gamma. I was part of a proposal to send some plasma and fields instrumentation to that. So hopefully those will be selected sometime this summer. But the point to get across is that there are a lot of implications for the way the surface weathers, the way the global lunar plasma environment is, because of the fact of these these crustal magnetic fields that are on the moon. Okay, so on to the actual ARTEMIS data analysis. So briefly, before I get into this, for those of you that perhaps are not familiar with the ARTEMIS mission, ARTEMIS was actually spun off, so to speak, from a 5-satellite mission called THEMIS, which was launched in 2007. THEMIS had an original goal of studying substorms and auroral onset in the terrestrial magnetosphere, and had a nested series of these orbits for all 5 probes. The outer 2 probes, starting in 2009 and 2010, were experiencing Earth shadows that were far too long. And in fact, if they were left in those orbits, the spacecraft would not have survived. And so the PI, Vasilis Angelopoulos at UCLA, had the clever idea of sending the outer 2 most probes to the moon, because they were actually more than halfway out to the moon at that point. And that's how the ARTEMIS mission was born. So between, I think it was January 2010, all the way until July 2011, the 2 probes were in this complex interplanetary orbit. And finally, in mid-2011, they were both captured in lunar orbit. And so this coming summer, July 2021, will actually be the 10-year anniversary of ARTEMIS in orbit around the moon. ARTEMIS essentially provides nearly everything we need to do this study. It has magnetic fields, both in DC and in AC, if you were interested in looking at waves. It has low energy and high energy, both electrons and ions. And all of these are reported as at least 4 seconds cadence. The spin period of the spacecraft is 4 seconds, and everything is timed to have a complete full 4 pi sky distribution over those 4 seconds. Additionally, the fact that ARTEMIS has been in orbit for so long really allows us to get this in a statistical nature, as opposed to single flybys from other spacecraft. This nearing the 10-year data set is really powerful. So the goal for this mission, or for this study, was to use the observations of these reflected protons from ARTEMIS and try and analyze where they were coming from on the surface of the moon. And this is both to construct a map of where this reflection is occurring and compare it to other observations by Kaguya and Chandrayaan, and then to try and investigate sort of the behavior, try and get under the surface a little bit of why or how these protons interacting with these crustal magnetic fields. So like I said, we have dual probe measurements. There's always 2 of them. They're in separate orbits. They're not timed to each other. So sometimes they're both far from the moon. Sometimes they're both close to the moon. Sometimes one or the other is close while another is far away. We have low energy ions, so we're using the electrostatic analyzer instrument that goes up to about 25 keV. We have high resolution vector magnetic fields. The periselene passes, the altitude varies in altitude. Anywhere between 10 kilometers is pretty low. We only have a very few of those getting that low, but we can get up to about 1,000 kilometers in periselene and every way in between there. And it's about a 24-hour period. It's a little bit longer than 24 hours, but about 1 day is how long it takes one of the ARTEMIS probes to go around the moon. At the time that I did this study, we had about 5.5 years of observation. Like I said, we're nearing 10 years. So in reality, if I were to go back and revisit this, we'd have twice or approximately twice the statistics. So what does an example observation of reflected protons from the moon look like with ARTEMIS? So this is an example I published in the 2017 paper. First off, this is a date where the moon is far out in the solar wind. This is Earth in the terrestrial magnetosphere. The sun the solar wind is coming from right to left in this image. So we're well out into the solar wind. We're undisturbed. We're not looking at the magnetosphere. On this particular, I think this is about an hour worth of data, the ARTEMIS P1 probe flew this way. And this line right here on the moon denotes the South Pole Aitken Basin, this large anomaly. So it flew right over the SPA anomaly. And the second probe, P2, happened to be farther away from the moon, far enough to not see any evidence of interactions on this state. If we compare the ion energy spectrum for P1 that is close to the moon and P2 that is far, the dominant signal is obviously the solar wind beam at just about 500 keV. But if you look closely in P1, you can actually see this extra signal that's both above the solar wind energy and then a little bit below the solar wind energy. And that is the signal of reflected protons coming back up from the lunar surface. If we break apart the data even a little bit more, because ARTEMIS has angular resolution in addition to energy and time resolution, and I first look at, let's see, this is ions coming just from the solar wind direction. We primarily see just the solar wind beam. If I look at ions coming from everywhere else in the sky at any energy other than the solar wind beam, I see this very dominant or very large population of reflected protons as ARTEMIS P1 comes in front of the moon. In contrast, if I look at ARTEMIS P2, which is far enough away from the moon to be undisturbed, I again see the solar wind beam looking in the solar wind direction, but I essentially see nothing. These are the few counts that you see here are actually natural background radiation from cosmic rays. There are no counts far away from the moon. This really speaks to the power of having two probes, where one is near the moon and the other is far away, that we can compare and we can say, aha, the one near the moon is seeing something that's lunar related. We know it's not a foreshock incident. We know it's not a CME passing by or an interplanetary shock or anything. It really allows us to distinguish different types of lunar effects. And so this is very clearly somehow related to the moon. And as I'll show, it's coming from reflection from a crustal magnetic anomaly. One thing to note on this day, if we take the partial moment, so I take the density of the solar wind and the density of the reflected protons, that's what's shown at the very bottom. And in this particular day, it was about 20% of the solar wind density was reflected back up from the lunar surface. So it's quite a non-negligible amount of flux that is being reflected back up from the surface. So how do I take these observations of reflected protons at the location and time of the ARTEMIS probe, which is in orbit around the moon, and somehow relate them to the location at which they were reflected from the lunar surface? So to do that, we generally take what's known as Louisvilles theorem, and that essentially tells you that phase space density, df, you often refer to it as df, where f is the distribution function, that little unit is conserved along trajectories with electromagnetic fields. And we can neglect things like collisions, or we neglect things like waves, which would violate this. But on these short time scales, we can generally assume that Louisville's theorem would hold. And so generally what we do is ARTEMIS, we take the fluxes that we measure, we convert them back to distribution function, which is easy to do with the data. And then for each of these, I have an angular vector and an energy, or equivalently a velocity. And I can simply trace them backwards in time using the measured electric and measured magnetic fields. And so an example of this is one day, this is the ARTEMIS probe passing by the surface of the moon. I took one time measurement from ARTEMIS, and I'm integrating backwards in time the ion trajectories that could have been observed by ARTEMIS. And you see the black ones happen to not intersect the moon. Those are measuring ions that are in the solar wind. But any of these trajectories that are colored in red had to have originated from the moon. Any ion flux that is coming from there had to have been an ion that somehow originated from the moon, but is really being reflected by some amount of crustal magnetic fields, as I'll show. So essentially, you repeat this same step for every single angle, every single energy, and every single time that ARTEMIS passes by in front of the moon. So again, this is from a single point. It's somewhere in the middle of here, but you could imagine doing this for the entire trajectory, for all energies, for all angles, and then repeating that for 5.5 years, as I'll show when we get to the statistical portion. So much of this has actually just a sort of a brute force backwards integration. I ran a whole bunch of computer cores at the lab to just basically do all this back tracing for every single trajectory. Returning to this just one example, I can show you that this amount of flux, I can show you where it's coming from on the surface when I integrated just this orbit. So essentially, when I look first at two things, one is just simply, where did these trajectories trace back to, right? So which region of the lunar surface is visible, so to speak, with reflected proton trajectories. So if you were observing an optical camera and you were looking, everything follows straight lines and you would see half of the moon or whatever size your aperture was for your camera. It's a little bit different for Artemis because our trajectories aren't following straight lines, they're following cycloids because of the electromagnetic fields. So at every time as Artemis is moving and the interplanetary electric fields are changing, we're essentially looking, so to speak, at a different region of the moon. So for this example, we happen to sort of fly low just above the South Pole Aitken Basin. That's what's seen here. These contours are crustal magnetic field in the background. And so we're kind of seeing this region on the moon, and maybe we're seeing a little bit of the northern part of the South Pole Aitken Basin. That's at least what Artemis could see on this day. Now, by tracing all of these back, all of these units of distribution function, I can tell you from within this region where we're actually seeing flux. And that's what's shown here on the bottom figure. So the brighter the colors is where more of the flux is coming from. And what's really interesting is that the flux that we saw of these reflected protons in the Artemis data on this single day are not spread evenly over this entire region. They're in fact concentrated right over the crustal magnetic fields, right where these theories would say that, yes, these crustal magnetic fields are strong enough to reflect the solar wind protons. And so this is a really nice example that we can see, even though Artemis can see this very broad region, much of the flux that's actually generating these reflected protons is coming from this very small region, just above the South Pole Aitken Basin, right over the magnetic fields. So this again is one day. Like I said, we now repeat this for 2 probes every time one probe is close to the moon, and we repeat it for 5.5 years, or however data you have, and you end up with pictures that look like this. So the top figure, again, is just the sheer number of observations I have in each small latitude and longitude bin on the surface. So one thing to note here is that the Artemis observations, or at least where we could see on the lunar surface, are not evenly distributed. And that's a fact, or it's a function of the fact that the Artemis orbits are generally in equatorial planes around the moon. So you see most of the measurements that we're able to see come from low passes near the equatorial region of the moon. And it's a lot harder and even impossible at the very highest latitudes for Artemis to see anything. Obviously something like, say, Kaguya or Chandrayaan, which was a polar orbiter, would be able to see those regions because they were flying over. Nevertheless, this is still a lot of data to be seen. And even at the higher latitudes, up above 60 or 70, you're still seeing upwards of 100,000 measurements per bin. So it's plenty enough to do statistics with. If I take all of those measurements and I do all of the back tracing, and I compute what is the fraction of reflected flux relative to the upstream solar wind, I end up with the picture that's on the lower half. And so what this is seeing is in a logarithmic scale, this is the fraction of solar wind flux that has been reflected by the lunar crustal magnetic fields or even the lunar surface and seen by Artemis. So the peak you see here is at about 10 to 12%. It's located right over the crustal magnetic anomalies that belong to the South Pole Aitken Basin region. But you can actually pick out several other regions, and I'll highlight these more in a little bit. But you can see that very nicely, these data, even though I've traced back all these individual trajectories, once I take the whole picture, you can quite clearly see where the crustal magnetic fields are. And in fact, some of these are pretty remarkable. You can see the Gerasimovich anomaly here. You can see the Reiner gamma magnetic anomaly here. We do also see the fact that outside of magnetized regions, so in regions where there are no crustal magnetic fields, we still see somewhere on 0.5% or 1% of solar wind proton reflected flux. So this was a really nice validation and a really nice use of the Artemis data set to be able to see that these crustal fields are really what's responsible for these large plumes of reflected protons that are coming off the dayside surface. And in fact, if I zoom in just on the map of where these fluxes are coming from, I can highlight a few different regions. Again, we talked about the South Pole Aitken Basin region. You see the heart of it is easily getting up to about, I think the max here is about 12% of the solar wind is being reflected back. As you get to, again, to lower and lower latitudes, it gets harder to observe. So it's possible we're missing some of the flux here. Nevertheless, you can actually see the Oriental antipode quite clearly here, getting up to something like 5 or 10% of reflected fluxes. Again, you can see the Gerasimovich anomaly, and then there are smaller anomalies to pick out, which are really appear to not be reflecting as much as you might expect. We see the Reiner gamma anomaly may be reflecting on the order of 1%. It's definitely worth keeping in mind that the angular resolution of the ARTEMIS bins can be quite coarse at times. Some of them are as large as almost 30 degrees by the time we have to sum neighboring bins. So the observations themselves are somewhat blurry. They're somewhat smeared out. If we are at far lower altitudes, we would be able to start to resolve much finer details. But at least when you take the entire data set, you have to have a trade-off, so to speak, with a little bit of degraded spatial resolution. But nevertheless, it's likely that since we know that the Reiner gamma anomaly is actually only covering, you know, a 10 by 10 square kilometer region, whereas each of these pixels I think is 50 to 100 kilometers across, that in reality, the flux is probably much more concentrated right at the Reiner gamma magnetic anomaly. But nevertheless, this is really exciting that we can see these type of reflections coming from exactly where we expect them to be, exactly at the crustal magnetic fields. So now is how here, once we've established where this picture is, sort of to first order, you can start to dig into a little bit more details, because in addition to just the magnitude of the flux, we can actually also look at the direction that flux is coming off of the crustal magnetic fields. And so this was just a quick comparison we did to some previously published, these were actually particle and cell or PIC models done by Mike Zimmerman back in 2015, where he took a simple dipole, he put it in the lunar surface, and he traced in his code where all these protons were going, and he did them at different times of day. And so in his model, he was predicting generally that at noon, you largely got this not quite isotropic, but somewhat isotropic spray of protons, where there was enough solar wind flux coming down, it was interacting with this complex electromagnetic fields at the surface, and generally speaking, the protons were going out nearly in all directions. And in fact, that's what we were generally able to confirm with ARTEMIS. The figure that's shown here on the left is the flux as a function of angle as the protons are leaving the crustal magnetic field. And in fact, there's a couple of spots here that are sort of anisotropic, but really to first order, there's protons going in all directions. You see them all over the place. And in fact, when we integrate over the polar angle, the sort of surface normal angle, you can actually see that this is a relatively flat function as a function of azimuth. So the protons are just sort of going in all directions equally. And that generally comports with the cartoon we put together, that when the solar wind flux is coming right down into the anomaly, right down at low solar zenith angles, you're generally getting protons to spray in all different directions. We can look at that, however, at sort of the opposite extreme, which is for high solar zenith angles. So as the crustal magnetic fields are getting close to the limb. And what we see here again in the simulations is here the solar wind is flowing from left to right, the same dipole magnetic field that's in the model. And we can actually see just more of a deflection as opposed to a full reflection, sort of just bouncing off and continuing mainly forward, that it's this highly directed proton reflection. And in fact, that's exactly what we see with ARTEMIS again. This is the sunward direction and the anti-sunward direction. And so you can see much of the solar wind flux that's being reflected by this crustal field at high solar zenith angles are generally continuing on their way forward and just being scattered off lightly. Again, if we integrate over the polar angle, you can get this nice reflection function. So there's some reflection coming back towards the solar wind, but primarily much of it is actually continuing on forward with the sort of the similar direction to which the solar wind was coming. And the cartoon that goes with this is, you know, something like this. The protons are coming in, they're generating mainly electric fields on sort of the upwind side the crustal magnetic anomaly and sort of just being lightly sort of bouncing off the top of the anomaly. That's generally the interpretation we have for this type of measurement that we see. So that's the study in a nutshell. There's probably a lot more to get into with that. But again, in summary, what I want to get across is that we see that the moon, we know that the moon has these regions of crustal magnetism, that they can reflect the solar wind protons before we strike the surface. As I've shown you, ARTEMIS sees these all over the place. We see them actually not only in front of the dayside moon, we see them in the lunar wake, we see them downstream, lots of different places around the moon. I use this backwards Louisville technique. It's actually very powerful. If you can get to the distribution function that you've measured, then you can trace it back to where these particles' origins are. And so we can make maps like these where we really do see the crustal magnetic fields being primarily the location where we see these reflected protons. We see that this can get up to 10 to 15%. That's kind of in the highest regions in the South Pole Aitken Basin. Again, I'd go into, I would venture to guess that really if you were able to get finer resolution down to 1 by 1 degree, you'd probably see upwards closer to 50%, even potentially even higher of the solar wind flux being reflected. Many of these anomalies are so small in scale that the ARTEMIS pixels just can't quite resolve them, at least in this statistical study. But perhaps on case studies, you can actually see even finer details with the crustal magnetic anomaly. So I would venture to guess that this number is probably a lower limit, in fact, and that there are regions that are smaller in size that are much more efficient at reflecting these solar wind protons. And we can also see that the scattering function from the lunar magnetic fields matches with what the simulations say, that when the crustal fields are oriented such that they're at the subsolar point, you tend to get lots more isotropic reflection from the anomalies, whereas when the crustal magnetic fields are getting closer and closer to the limb, it's a lot more forward scattering. And part of the reason why this is important to measure as well is that goes into later effects about how these protons are actually being repicked up in the solar wind and how they disturb things farther down the wake and on the side. And there's a lot more other work that could look at that with the ARTEMIS data set. But again, is perhaps something to speak about in another seminar. So I hope you've enjoyed this small nugget of ARTEMIS science. Like I said, there's plenty more to pick from. And I'm more than happy to take any and all questions that you might have. So please.
Yeah, Andrew, thank you so much on this talk. Any question from audience? If you have, please unmute yourself and ask the question first. I have a couple of questions to ask you.
Of course.
One thing, of course, is that the whole thing has to do with the magnetic anomalies. Mm-hmm. And what is the origin of the magnetic anomalies? Right.
So that is a very big question. I think you can go through the literature and you can easily pick out 4, 5, maybe in 10 different theories for where these crustal magnetic anomalies come from. There are some theories that talk about the fact that many of these anomalies happen to be on the opposite side of the moon from several of the major impact basins. So there are theories that have to do with, you have a large impactor colliding with the moon, it creates a very hot plasma. That plasma and ejecta actually wrap all the way around the moon, and they focus the magnetic field so strongly in the antipodal point that they shock magnetize the crust. That's a theory it's been proposed for many decades. It's typically something like that Lon Hood has put forward. There's more recent simulations that suggest that's not a very efficient or plausible process. So that's still open. There are things like shock magnetization, that it's locally the point of impact that you can shock magnetize materials. Much of it, though, I think is actually probably remnants from when the moon had a dipolar field. So there's a lot of really recent research showing that in addition to a very strong period of magnetic fields in the first 100 million years or so of the moon's existence, that actually for the first 2 billion years or so of the moon's existence, it had a global dipolar field that was on the order of 5 microtesla. And so what that implies is that if you had subsequent impacts, during this global paleomagnetic field era, that the impact ejecta melt would be subjected to very strong magnetic fields and would imprint the global paleomagnetic field in these impact melts. I think there's a lot more work that has to be done to distinguish between any of these theories. And if I honestly had to guess, I'd say that many of these different anomalies could actually be caused by several different of these processes. I don't actually think there's one theory that fits every single crustal magnetic field that's on the lunar surface. But it could be anything like impacts. It could have to do with the paleomagnetic fields. Those are probably the leading theories for where these crustal fields come from.
Right. Okay. Other thing is that you have proposed you want to put a lander on the site of a magnetic anomaly, right?
Yes.
To measure the electric field, or what, or to measure the reflected particles.
Yeah. So this was a kind of late breaking announcement that NASA put out. Let's see, it was last summer or so. That they announced that they were considering lunar landers to several regions on the moon, and one of which is the Reiner gamma anomaly, which is shown right here. So that proposal call was released, let's see, sometime in November 2020, and I actually led a team from here at Berkeley to build what would essentially be a magnetometer, an ion instrument, and an electron instrument to sit on the lander and sit right in the heart of the anomaly, and to measure not only the magnetic fields, of course, but what the flux of solar and protons that were making it down to the surface were, and how they varied as a function of the lunar day. So I think that would be a very exciting mission to be a part of. The proposals are currently under review. I know that it was a popular call. I know there were many proposals to it. So I think it's small chances for anybody to be picked, but I think it'd be a very exciting mission to work on. But it is worth noting that NASA picked the Reiner gamma anomaly in particular because there is so much interest from the community in it. There's a lot of simulation work. There's a lot of observational work that's been done for it. But what's really missing is an in situ measurement, especially at the surface, right in the heart of Reiner gamma. So.
And you don't want to put a ENA detector there?
So I think generally for the moon, an ENA detector is best when it's looking down towards the surface and being able to look at the global fields or the global flux of the ENAs coming back upwards. I think that you could potentially get an ENA that maybe or an ENA instrument that we're looking off the side and seeing some of the glancing ENA conversion. That's certainly a possibility that you could get on these types of landers as well. Berkeley, we don't build ENA detectors, so I don't happen to have one that we could easily put as part of our proposal. But I wouldn't be surprised if other groups had proposed similar instruments or such instruments for some of these landers. So.
Because on Chang'e 4, they put a ENA detector on the lander, and I think you might know that too.
I probably heard it at one point. I don't know that I have seen results or anything at the moment, but I'd be very curious to see what it is they were seeing being converted off the surface as ENAs. So.
Another question is that if I have a polar orbiter, and I want to do something like you're talking about, to analyze the reflected protons and so on, and what can we do, better? Or to improve the understanding.
I think one of the limitations with this study that I mentioned to some degree is the sort of the coarse resolution that I had to resort to for this, and part of the reason for that is that the ARTEMIS probes are at varying altitudes as they're going through their orbits, and I'm tracing backwards in time from the location of the ARTEMIS orbit back to the surface, and because the pixels of the plasma spectrometer can sometimes be as wide as, they're 22.5 degrees in one direction, and I think they're 6 in the other, but sometimes because of data constraints, we sum them together. So ARTEMIS is seeing sort of an averaged angular region in some of these, and that translates directly into how precise we could be at the surface. In contrast, if you had an orbiter that it was at a constant altitude and that had a fairly refined angular resolution, I think you'd easily be able to pick out much finer details. And in fact, I can probably go back and show an example. If you looked at the Chandrian observations that Charles Lua put together, you can get a sense that they had much smaller angular resolution because they were at lower altitudes, and especially they were at a constant altitude or a near constant altitude, which prevents a lot of the uncertainty when you're tracing back these trajectories. So Charles' work from Chandrian in 2011 had a lot greater spatial detail, even if it didn't have as much data in terms of the amount of statistics. So just by virtue of being on a polar orbit, I think you'd have a little bit of an advantage for these types of highly resolved studies that you might want to do.
Great. So thanks. Anyone has questions for Andrew?
Yes.
Yeah, please.
Hi, Andrew. I'm Tomoko Nanawa from Japan.
Yes.
Thank you very much for very nice talk and beautiful result. And I'm interested in small one and how small both the map is the average image, but for individual case, you can trace the reflected particle and back to the moon, but you might not find any strong magnetic field in that area. Can you tell me smallest size of the crustal magnetic field that can reflect the particle?
So from a theoretical perspective, that's somewhat hard to say, partially because we just simply haven't measured to that small of a degree. I know that, I don't know that I put the figure in here, but this Gerasimovich paper from let's see, this was Fatemi et al. 2015. You know, they had scale sizes that were on, I think it was probably 20 to 50 kilometers, and we were able to see in the model that these were able to reflect protons. One of the challenges in that is that much of it depends on the topology of the magnetic fields. And the topology is not very well constrained. And it's not very well constrained because we typically don't have measurements at 1 kilometer altitude or 5 kilometers altitude or 10 kilometers altitude. Those are dangerous altitudes for a spacecraft to be at for very long. So the fine scale detail, I think, is actually still an open question, partially because we just don't have measurements of what the topology is there at the moment. I think you can make an argument if I go and I look at, this is the Reiner gamma crustal magnetic anomaly. And so you can see this is a 10 kilometer scale bar. So it's about 10 kilometers across the center and maybe 10 kilometers in these outer lobes. This anomaly we can see remotely is very effective at reflecting magnetic fields, reflecting protons, excuse me. So we know that we can at least get down to the 10 kilometer scale and have something that's strongly and coherently magnetized enough to reflect solar wind protons. Right? Reiner gamma is probably the best example of a small but very powerful crustal magnetic anomaly. So.
Thank you. And I feel that compression or rarefaction is somewhat a magnet-hydrodynamic phenomena, but the particle reflection is not the hydrodynamic phenomena. So how small scale compression or rim compression or something like that would be produced by such kind of small scale reflection?
Sure. So there are some nice ARTEMIS observations of this. So let's see, I've got, this is, like I said, this is work that I'm just recently working on, and the color scale isn't the best here, but you can kind of see that, you know, one of all these pixels that are lighting up in very light red, those are the compressions kind of trailing off the limb of the moon. And those match well with what we see in the hybrid simulations. So, you know, these are, you know, the pixel size here is just something I've chosen for the statistical study. But, you know, these are 100 kilometers across or so. But there's a paper, if I zoom real quick to, here we go. So there's a paper that Jasper Holocaust put together that looked at these small scale collisional shocks. And these are very, very small, you know, tens to hundreds of kilometers that Artemis is essentially flying through. And what Jasper was showing here essentially is these orange trajectories are reflected protons that are being reflected from a very small scale source on the lunar day side. And they have to be reflected in such a way that they initially go in a direction that opposes the interplanetary electric field. And that initially slows the protons and then turns them around. And when those protons are slowing, which is kind of what you're seeing right here, you see that them kind of going through the low energy part of their cycloid, they represent then a very high density obstacle for the solar wind. And that's actually what gives you a shock that's coming off the limb of the surface. And so we see that in the Artemis data. We see a huge compression, you know, a factor of 2 or more compression in the magnetic field as Artemis is flying even downstream. This is the Artemis orbit for this example in the dashed line. And so you can see the reflected protons in the ion energy spectrum themselves. You can actually see the heated electrons that are downstream of this shock as Artemis crosses through it. And the pile up and the density from this compression, kind of a compressional wave that's coming off the side of the moon. So Artemis sees these as well, not quite as frequently, because you need certain circumstances where you have a strong enough anomaly and reflecting protons in such a way that the interplanetary electric field first slows them down. And when they slow down, they become a large obstacle. But we do have evidence that these exist in the data set. And Jasper's got at least one paper on it, but there's still plenty more to look at in the data set. So.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Yep. Any other questions? We still have time for one more question.
Hi, Andrew.
Hey, Xiaosui.
Hello. Can I ask you about, there's a feature in your reflective flux map. Can I go to that figure? Yeah, that one. Right, so I see a relatively high reflective flux at the corner, the upright corner where you don't really have crustal fields. Do you think it's just you don't have enough Counting statistics or something?
I think that's possible. I think, you know, two things to keep in mind. The sort of large regions where you see no crustal magnetic field, those are well known to be unmagnetized. This small feature, especially the fact that it's at higher latitudes, you know, first off, it's really only at the 1 or 2% level. My guess is, if I had to guess, it's probably a little bit of contamination from observations that took place in the magnetosheath. I tried to cut those out of the data set as best as possible. But because you can, if I go and show a different figure of, right, so this is the map here on the bottom, but this is where I have all the statistics of how many observations. So you can see that this region is really in a statistics poor spot of observation. You know, it's really getting down to, some of these pixels only have 100 individual measurements. That's pretty low compared to the several million that I have in the middle. So I'd be a little wary of interpreting these or some of these lower latitude features as anything significant, because that's a difficult, you know, if you imagine the protons have to reflect off of the polar regions and come all the way back down to the equatorial regions, that's a pretty rare event to occur in the data set. So.
I see. Yeah, I was just wondering how good the correlation between the reflective flux versus the crustal strength. You actually didn't just plot this ratio.
That's a good suggestion. Maybe you should have been on this paper, Xiaosui. That's a good point. I did not actually even do just the correlation between known crustal field strength and the reflection fraction, but since I did this study, there's another 5 years worth of data, so it's maybe something for a follow-up study to see. So
yeah, maybe I wonder if you can find some more interesting features in the crustal magnetism from this reflective photon. reflected proton data.
I think it would be interesting. I think, you know, one of the things that I never got around to with this data set is, for example, splitting it by something like low solar wind pressure and high solar wind pressure to see if there were any changes, or low or fast solar wind speed. I just averaged everything together. So there are definitely more things to dig into with this data set. So.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. We have to let Andrew go because we have another talk by Matthias Schuck. But then I noticed that Andrew, you're working also on this kind of thing, like a space weathering effect on the grains, right? On the lunar grain.
Yes.
So you have to come back and give another talk.
I would be happy to. That's another cool ARTEMIS paper. I would be more than happy to talk about. It's very interesting work. So.
Because I have to make a very difficult decision to ask you which one to talk, you know. So
I am always happy to talk about the moon, and I'm always happy to talk about ARTEMIS science. So anytime is great for me. So.
Okay, good. Thank you, Andrew.
All right.
Yeah, thank
you so much.
Yeah, I'll contact you for the next talk.
Very good. All right. Well, have a lovely day in Taiwan. So.
Yeah, you too.
Perfect.
Have a good sleep. Yeah.